I'll share again, so we'll get started. Great. Okay, so back to the start. So this is one of two writing workshops in this academic writing workshop series. So this is just about understanding the nuts and bolts of academic writing. And the second workshop will be more detail about research skills, critical writing, critical thinking skills, that kind of thing. But for this workshop then, the overview of the workshop series is basically workshop 1, understanding nuts and bolts of academic writing, workshop 2, developing research approaches and critical thinking skills. So that's what we'll be looking at next time. But for today, there's a few learning outcomes for the workshop. Firstly, we're going to try and understand the difference between formal and informal writing. So for example, things like active voice, passive voice, third and first person, formal tone and colloquial writing. So there's a big difference there. And that will play a role in academic writing. It's important to know the difference when you're writing your essays for an academic degree. Second learning outcome, to think more about writing structure. So for example, things like paragraphing, signposting, things like that. And third, to understand and to be able to use Harvard citational practice, both in text and in the reference list. So this is something really important. You need to be able to reference correctly. Now, you may ask, like, why does academic writing practice matter? Well, there are a number of reasons why it does matter, if we think about it a bit more. Now, the first thing I would say is it allows us to express our ideas clearly. It also ensures that we're communicating in an appropriate style, because as we'll go along with this, and especially when we're talking about the abstract exercise, which hopefully you've managed to look at the abstracts, because we're going to be working on them in the second part of this workshop. There's a big difference between using slang and colloquialisms that you'll use in everyday speech and, for instance, writing in a more formal style. So that's something we'll touch on later. So it also allows us to reference the work of others clearly and effectively. Offers an opportunity to describe and analyze work within the existing literature. So it's always important to build on what has already been done, and that's what academic writing essentially does. And also it enables us to showcase our critical thinking skills. And that will be discussed a bit more in the second workshop, actually, where that's directly about critical thinking skills. So there are some reasons why academic writing practice does matter. But there are going to be kind of key messages from this workshop series. And I think there are two key messages I would tell anyone as you are writing and editing your work before submitting it. My first piece of advice would be, if in doubt, check it out. So if you're unsure of anything, for instance, a certain fact or a figure you're writing about, make sure to go back to the publication and check it is correct. The same thing with referencing. If you're unsure if your style of referencing is correct, don't just leave it to uncertainty, but check. For instance, there's a how to reference guide on the TLP. You could easily just have a look at that and make sure you're doing your formatting and punctuation correctly. They're just a few examples. The second message then, which I'm going to reiterate, is if in doubt, leave it out. So when you're writing, especially when you're towards the end of writing your thesis, for instance, there's going to come a point where you're reading through and you're thinking to yourself, especially if you have too many words and you need to edit out some words to get it to the appropriate word count. There is a point where you have to say what is relevant here, what isn't, what is background noise and is not really part of the main theme, for instance, to use an analogy. And if you're reading through, always use your instinct. If you feel like something is not really directly contributing to your argument or the topic of your thesis, then just leave it out. Don't even think about it. That would be my second piece of advice. So those are two key messages that I want to kind of emphasize in both workshops, really. And we'll kind of discuss these a bit more later on. As I say, in the second part of this workshop, we're going to be looking at some abstracts, which I hope you've managed to have a look at, just to see what your thoughts are on their quality in terms of academic content and the way they're written. But that'll be after we go through this initial section. Feel free, by the way, to write any comments or questions you have in the chat box, and I'll get to them in the break. If you have any questions, you can do that as we go along, and I'll answer them later while you're doing the abstract exercise. Anyway, we'll keep going for now. I'm going to move to the first topic, the first learning outcome I mentioned. So, for instance, what are the nuts and bolts of academic writing? So the first thing I did mention is formal versus informal writing. So what is the difference then? Well, formal writing adopts a clear formal language. So it's not using any colloquialisms or slang words, for instance. So it's using kind of more neutral, objective language. So it also references the work of scholars to discuss a topic and to build a line of argumentation. So it basically uses referencing, in other words. Other point, answers or debates a specific question or a field. So in this way, it's very focused form of writing. It's not just writing about what you did yesterday, for instance, which is very, very kind of just informal topic. You're actually focusing in on a particular question that, you know, you've built up and chosen because there is a lacuna or a specific gap in the field of existing research that you've identified and that you want to explore. That's what academic writing is about. So also it needs to have a clear layout and structure, or a logical structure as it's often described. So, you know, paragraphs fit in and there's a flow. It makes sense that one paragraph goes after another, for instance. That's a key part of academic writing. It's not just kind of lots of jargon thrown together and it has no flow. So it's also grammatically correct, of course. So you need to use your spell check and make sure that everything is spelt and the grammar is correct. Now, all those points are more or less taken from Learn Higher, which I have the source on the source list at the end, reference list, that you can look up if you want to explore any of these points a bit further. I'm going to give some examples of some of these things in a minute anyway that you can look through for yourself. Okay, so I'm going to highlight some common issues now that often come up when I'm reading through academic essays. And they do need to be taken into account because they are common errors, so they come up a lot. And if you're aware of them, then you can write in a better way because you can just make sure you don't do any of these things, essentially. So the passive voice is something I need to explain because it happens quite often when I'm reading essays, and it's always better to write in the active voice rather than the passive voice. Now, passive voice, it occurs when the subject of the sentence has something done to it by someone or something, and I'll explain that in a minute. Active voice occurs when the subject of the sentence is performing the action. Now, I'm going to give an example of this, and you always need to try and use the active voice as much as possible. Active voice, yes. Here is an example, okay? You can have a quick look at it. This is a good example, hence the smiley face. So the salt water corroded the metal beams. So essentially, you very clearly see who the subject of the sentence is, and they're performing the action. So the salt water is corroding the metal beams. Whereas in this second example, passive voice, which not so good. I mean, it's not completely wrong, but it's something that should avoid. The metal beams were corroded by the salt water. So you see, it means the same thing. So you're still saying that these metal beams have been corroded and the salt water did it, but the sentence has been turned around. And this is not necessarily as good because, as you can see, it's a more bulky sentence. So it's a longer sentence. And it's a bit more clunky. You know, the first example is nice and clear. It's a very simple example, but you know, the salt water corroded the metal beams. Whereas in the second one, you have an extra few words and you're putting the subject of this, like the thing that's performing the action, you're putting it at the end of the sentence. So it sounds a bit more wordy. So the first example is generally the one to do. Now, this is just one example. You'd have to, you know, find it in your own writing as you go along, and try to keep it in the active voice as much as possible. I hope you understand what the difference is here, but do write in the chat box if you don't understand what I'm talking about in relation to this, or you can raise your hand if you want. This is all recorded, by the way, so if you want to look back at any of these points, it will be on the forum. I'm glad I remembered to record at the start. Okay, some more examples then. Common issue number 2, failing to reference. This is a major one, especially when you're writing a research thesis. Basically, you have to reference. If you're just talking to your friend about something that happened yesterday, you're not going to say Paul 2022 said this, because that's a completely different context and, you know, it's not academic writing you're doing. But if you're doing academic writing, you absolutely need to reference and use the appropriate style. And we're using Harvard referencing in MLA. So yeah, all points need to be backed up by relevant academic literature. Otherwise, your work will offer purely speculation. I do need to emphasize that point. All scientific work requires you to build on existing literature and findings. So I have to keep highlighting that point. Okay. I see there's one question in the chat. I'm going to keep going for the moment, but I will answer it a bit later. Okay. I think I have an example of this here, so you can see what I mean. So this is an example. I'm not going to read it for you, but you can just think to yourself, what is the issue with this particular example? What could this, it's something I just made up myself purely for this exercise, but what are the issues with this particular example then? I'll leave you to read it and then yeah. So hopefully you've had a chance to have a quick look at this. Now, as you see, it's like not a very badly written thing per se, but as you'll see, there are statistics in this little example that have no backing up. So saying like 1 football field of forest is destroyed every 6 seconds, it's like, says who? You could have just made that up out of thin air if you wanted. But if you give a statistic, you need to reference it. So say that was a statistic from UN in a 2016 publication, then you need to reference UN 2016 in brackets. Preferably, if you're giving a figure, a particular figure, you should also maybe mention the page number for where you got that figure as well. Be as specific as you possibly can with the referencing. So yeah, that's the main issue with this little example. Hopefully you can see that yourself, that this statistic in the second sentence needs to be backed up with relation to literature. Hopefully that makes sense. You can look back at all of these examples, as I say. Okay. Moving on to another common issue, number 3. Now, this is pretty important because like, as you know, an academic piece of writing is a very focused piece of writing. You're answering a certain question within a certain field. So lacking focus is quite a big thing. All research must have a clear focus and line of argumentation. So you need to be arguing something which builds on existing scholarly literature. So basically an important thing to note here is that your research scope should not be too broad. So this is what you do at the start of any project, as some of you maybe at the moment. You need to have a precise enough question to ask and to answer in order for the project to be feasible. I'm just looking at questions pretty quickly on the chat. Any notes taking software? What do you recommend? Taking notes? Well, there may be these days, to be honest. I always just take notes by hand, but everyone is different. The main thing, I'm going to get onto it a bit later, actually. I think it's in this workshop about how to take notes efficiently, so that essentially the notes you're taking are not just kind of almost copying what you've just read, but it's in your own words and you have to be concise. That's what I always do, just very shorthand, make sure you've understood the text, write some critical comments on it. But everyone has their own thing, really. I'm sure there are some platforms online. I've never actually used them myself for taking notes these days, but I always just use by hand. Emma, are we allowed to use other resources to back up our information if there is limited? Yeah, this is something that happens because sometimes you're doing research maybe on a company or something. And in this case, often it's good, you can use reports or websites from the company if they're available. Or, you know, sometimes you can find relevant trade publications or blogs on trade publications, or yeah, it all depends on the context and what you're researching essentially, as to, you know, but obviously, and this is something I'll emphasize in probably more in the second workshop actually, but is to use kind of good peer-reviewed journal articles. That's your first port of call, really. If you're doing any academic work, yeah, because they've gone through generally a kind of, you know, process where the work has been critiqued. So therefore, it is best, if possible, to use mostly peer-reviewed journals, but all depends on your topic, and it's not wrong per se to be using, you know, trade publications or blogs or things like that, depending on the context. How do you reference a Zoom interview without having the permission of quoting the industry expert? You need permission from whoever you're doing an interview with. That's why we use consent forms and information sheets before carrying out the interview, because you cannot just reference people's material if they have not given consent. So that is important. If you have consent from them, then you just reference it as you would any other interview. So there's a particular format in Harvard referencing. Basically, you give the name of the person, the date of the interview, and just say it's an interview in your reference list. But you absolutely have to have permission in order to quote anyone. That's essentially it. Hope that answers your question. Anyway, I'm going to go back to this. If there are any other further comments on that, do write in the chat box. So I was talking about lacking focus, which I kind of went off on a tangent there, but this is an example of lacking focus. So you can see for yourself. Now, this is an example I made up myself, but this thesis will examine the history of shipbuilding from prehistory to the present. Now, you can write in the chat box if you want what you think is wrong with this particular example, but I would say it's much, much too broad, as in there's no way you can possibly explore this topic, even in a PhD, because you'd essentially have probably 10 encyclopedia entries if you did this. Yeah, so you need to have a particular question and focus, and perhaps a chronological frame for the question you ask, because otherwise this is going to get into like 4 PhDs put together sort of territory. So just bear that in mind, that you need to have a feasible and focused topic and question as you carry out your research. Okay. Common issue 4, use of the personal voice. Now, it's not completely wrong to use the personal voice, but sometimes it's okay, but generally speaking, in scientific writing, it should be objective. And the personal voice, for instance, the use of the words I, me, my, those kind of things should be used very sparingly. So it's not, completely wrong that, it's not like you can never, ever, ever use them, but just not in every sentence be saying, I think this and I think that, because it's like it's more like something you would find in a blog or a kind of just a personal piece of writing. Say if someone's writing a memoir or a piece of life writing, it's very different than if you're writing a scientific essay or a piece for publication, for instance. So just beware of that a little bit. It's a different style of writing, more formal, I guess. The main point is actually to build a line of argumentation, drawing on the work of relevant scholars. I know I've said that point many times, but it is actually very important. Third person, so like he, her, she, those things should be employed most frequently. The first person only occasionally. So you can use I, me, my very sparingly. So I have to emphasize this point. Second person you is generally avoided in academic writing. So it sounds quite accusing, saying, you did this, you did that. That's generally avoided. You can use first person very sparingly, as I say, but most things are kept quite objective, as in, the purpose of this essay is to, that's an example of kind of, writing in this objective style where you're kind of avoiding the first person a little bit. So I think I have an example here of, yes, okay. You can read this yourself. So this is a good example, the first one, and this is a not so good example, and hopefully you will see why as you read through. So just have a quick look through yourselves. Okay, hopefully you've managed to have a very quick look through these two examples. You can write in the chat box if you want why you think the first one might be better and why the second one is not so good. It's not that the second one, is awful. It does use some referencing. But as you'll see, and you can look back on these examples afterwards, basically the first one kind of avoids the first person as much as possible. So it's keeping it nice and objective. So you're saying Muller and Davidson argue, the authors offer various strategies, yet the work can be critiqued on the basis that. So you'll see there, that's kind of written in objective, not using the first person tone. Whereas in the second example, it's automatically using I argue that, yet I also believe that, and this awful avoid this last one. You could further expand these findings by, I would avoid that, just avoid using the word and you, which is basically second person, and preferably do not use that. So the first example is better, as hopefully you can see, because it's keeping it objective and neutral in tone, generally avoiding the first person. So that's a quick example that you can look back on and just see for yourselves. Hopefully that the second one isn't quite as good as the first. Right. Common error 5, and it's something important to highlight. Spelling, grammar, punctuation is all really important. Basically, poor spelling, punctuation, and grammar can have an impact on how information is conveyed. So I think it's important to take this into account, because, you could have a good essay or a good piece of work, but ultimately, if it's presented poorly, it'll just bring down marks unnecessarily, especially as there are so many ways you can check your work before submitting the final thing. So check through all your work in advance of submission to ensure accuracy. And I actually always encourage students to read their work aloud. That might sound weird and you might be thinking to yourself, why the hell am I reading this to myself? But actually, when you read aloud, you hear for yourself, almost like listening to a song or whatever, how the words flow and how it all fits together. And sometimes when you read aloud, you kind of say, oh, why is that sentence there? It should have been in the previous paragraph, or you just realize things. Whereas if you're just looking at something on a page, it often doesn't help very much. So I encourage you to read work aloud to yourself so that you really hear for yourself what is going on with it. Some common errors I see with kind of spelling, grammar, things like this is, I've given some examples here just so you're aware of them. Some of them are quite basic, but they do happen quite often. So the usage of the word there with T-H-E-R-E and there, T-H-E-I-R, they're very different words. They sound the same. The first is related to location. The second is related to possession. So you need to be aware of the difference. So yeah, you could say that, the object is over there, but you say that their phone is on the table. So their phone refers to possession. Whereas the first example, you're pointing something over there, it's a location, but they're very different. They sound the same. So just be aware of difference in those. One that comes up very often is affect and effect, so A and E. The simplest way of describing this is the first is a process, the second is an outcome. Yeah, so you could say, how does this affect that, which is A, whereas the effect with an E is the outcome of what has affected it. Hopefully that makes sense. I think I'm going to give an example in a minute of that. Possession is another thing, just the use of apostrophes. So for instance, you might have the word birds, but if you're referring to the bird's nest, then you need an apostrophe after the S. That's plural and plural possessive. If it's singular, one bird, so bird, and you're referring to the bird's nest, you need apostrophe S. Sometimes I see apostrophes left out and they need to be there. It's another grammatical issue. I think I may have written examples out here. Maybe not, but hopefully you'll understand what I've just said. This on the screen, you'll see my key message. If in doubt, check it out. So for instance, there are numerous spell checkers now that will automatically tell you, especially on Microsoft Word, if there's a spelling error, if there's a grammatical error, and you just need to check through and fix every error that you see. And hopefully you can learn from that process as well. So that is my first key message, check it out. Same goes for anything. If you're unsure of anything you've written, facts, whether the fact is correct, go back and check it. So no point leaving it to chance, basically. You might be wondering why there's a very cute panda on the screen, but essentially that's because I could not get copyright permission to put the cover of the book I want to mention on the screen. So hence, it's called Eats, Shoots and Leaves, the Zero Tolerance Approach to Punctuation. It covers lots of grammar and spelling things and has a very cute panda on the cover, but I couldn't get permission. So here he is. I really recommend that book if you really want to look into, I know it's a very dry topic, but just how do I use punctuation? How do I make sure my grammar is all correct? It's very useful for that, has really useful tips. And it's, as grammar books go, it's a bit more exciting and kind of written in a more interesting way than your average one. So if you want to have a look at that, I'm sure it's actually in the library, Plymouth University Library, available online as well. So that's a useful one just for writing in general. I think I just have another couple of common issues to go through, and I'll look at your questions in 1 minute, so bear with me, and then we'll move on to the abstracts exercise as well, which hopefully you've managed to look through. So writing structure, and I think this was another of the key things I mentioned on the learning outcome. So each sentence should follow on from the preceding one in a logical order. Now, this is really, really important. There needs to be a sequencing in what you write so that it makes sense. Paragraphs, so each paragraph you write, it should generally have at least 3 sentences and should make a key point, because I often see paragraphs that, you know, might only have 2 sentences in it, and that's not really a paragraph. It needs to have at least 3 really to make a point. And you can move on to a new paragraph to address a new issue, which follows on logically from the previous paragraph. And then sections. So each section should conclude by providing a brief summary of what has been discussed and a linking sentence to the next section. So these linking sentences are also called signposts, and I'm going to talk about them a bit more now. Basically, yes, in academic writing and in any writing really, you need to be briefly summarizing what you've just talked about in a section and pointing towards the next section and what that's going to discuss. Otherwise, the reader will be left wondering, what is this whole thing about? How does this thing fit together? So there needs to be constant signposting throughout your whole thesis. It's really important, and it'll make a world of difference to the reader, that they won't feel like they're lost in a labyrinth, but they'll feel like, oh, I know where this thing is going, essentially. So some useful tips in this regard, I would say make every word count. Basically, editing is a huge, really important step, especially when you're coming towards the end of writing. Basically, there should be no unnecessary words, really. You know, it's important to keep the writing as concise as you possibly can. So if there are unnecessary words or sentences, indeed, that are not really contributing to your argument, then I would suggest just getting rid of them. Because often you can get a word count down, especially if you're over the word count, just by taking out simple unnecessary words, you can get the word count down quite a lot. So read through, always read through, read aloud, as I've just said, and make sure that every word on the page is actually necessary. If in doubt, leave it out. Yes, that is really important. It's the key thing about editing, really. And it needs to be done at all stages of your research project, really, but especially when you're in final stages. Be ruthless. So if you really are feeling something is unnecessary, just get rid of it. That would be my advice. There are some key writing tips I would always recommend, basically, when you're going through. So in relation to writing structure, then there are another series of common issues which I need to go through with this. Again, you can look back on all of this later if you want, because I know it's a lot to take in. One common issue is the lack of structure and flow, which can really inhibit the writing. And this refers to both the overall structure of the thesis and the links between sections and paragraphs. So it's the overall thing, and it's the sections that they all make sense in relation to one another. I've given some examples here of particular elements that you need to look out for. So the first thing is connecting sentences. So I've given an example here about what I mean when I say it's important to summarize what's gone before and to look towards what is coming up. Both need to be done in order for the reader to really understand what's going on and where the writing is going. So I'll leave you to read this little 2 sentences. So hopefully, as you'll see here, the first sentence says this section has demonstrated that, So you're saying what the section, this made up section that I'm talking about, has discussed. And then your cue for feeding forward to the next section is, in the next section, these thoughts will be taken forward by. So hopefully you see what I mean. This kind of writing needs to be threaded throughout your whole work, because essentially you need to look back constantly and you need to look forward constantly so that the reader really knows where it's all going. So that's kind of connecting sentences, I call them, but really it's part of the whole signposting thing that I need to emphasize in this. Then there's overall structure. So I've given another example here, which I'll allow you to read through for yourself. Hopefully you will see that this example is not really structured very well. It's like a jigsaw. You have to think about what makes sense in order for this to fit together. So really this little abstract I've put up here, which is not ordered correctly, and you can correct me if you think I'm wrong, but I think basically it should start with, you know, what's been done before. So previous research is highlighted. It definitely should not start with discussing the expected findings, because that should go at the end of a little abstract. So yeah, so this needs to be reordered. So it kind of discusses previous research, the research question, then the methodology, which currently is at the end of this abstract, and then the expected findings. So as you'll see, the information is here, but it's just not ordered correctly. So it's really important that you take this into account, overall structure. So that's another example of an important building block or element of writing. Common error to sentences that never end. I see this quite often. So keep your sentences short and concise, I would recommend. If you are going to use a slightly longer sentence, make sure you're using connecting punctuation and clauses that make sense. But I would encourage you not to keep your sentences going on forever, because it makes it hard for the reader to deal with. Sometimes sentences can be divided up into 2 or 3, for instance. So, as I said, you can use commas, colons, semicolons, obviously in a grammatically and correct way to join sentences. But do not let sentences run on for too long if they can be more comfortably divided into 2 or more. And that's really important. Just try and keep it as clear and concise as you possibly can when you're writing. It's often better to be simpler than to make it, you know, look really fancy and academic, as you say. I'd much rather read something that's quite simply phrased and shorter sentences than really, really long, expansive ones that are trying too hard. I think I have an example here of what I mean, so you'll see. So you can read this one for yourself, but I think it is worth reading it out, because even this, I'm emphasizing again why it's important to read your work aloud, because by reading this sentence aloud alone, you will see automatically that's too long and that it can easily be divided up. So I'm going to try and say this in one breath. Arnoldson, 2004, explored the impact of climate change on polar ice caps, identifying human activities such as the burning of carbon as key aspects of global climate change, and hypothesizing that by 2050, the polar caps will be almost completely depleted, which seems likely. You can see by reading that loud, it's way, way too long. I just about managed that in one breath. I don't know how, but it's too long and cumbersome. This could actually be quite easily divided up. So you could use, the first part of the sentence. Arnoldson explored the impact of climate change on polar ice caps, identifying human activities such as the burning of carbon as key aspects of global climate change, full stop. So that's where you can divide up the sentence. He hypothesized, so you start the sentence anew there, instead of continuing on with and hypothesizing, because it's making it way too long. So he hypothesized that by 2050, the polar caps will be almost completely depleted, full stop. You don't actually need the which seems likely bit at the end. That's what I'm talking about in relation to editing, taking out unnecessary words, because that is not needed. It's a pure speculation. So that's how you can divide up that particular example to make it just easier for the reader and better writing. Very simple example, but I think it's a good one. Okay. Oh, we're already on to the abstract exercise. Time flies. So hopefully you've all managed to basically have a look at these abstracts that were sent on in advance. If not, I'm going to put them up on the screen anyway. So I'll answer your questions in 1 minute as well, now that I have some time. What are your thoughts on these pieces of writing? Which do you think is more successful in terms of spelling, grammar, structure, and flow? So that's a really important question to consider, okay? I'm going to put up the abstracts on the screen. I'm going to stop sharing just for 1 minute. Hopefully everything is okay with you guys. And then we're going to discuss. So I'm going to give you a few minutes to look through the abstracts again, and we're going to basically discuss them. And I want you to write the order you think is best. So going from the abstract that you think is the best. So say if you think abstract 2 is the best, then you put that number first, because we're going from 1 to 4. So I want you to write the numbers of the abstracts from best to worst in the chat box, and then we're going to discuss it afterwards. So I hope that all makes sense. Let me know if not. I'm going to answer your questions as well in 1 minute. So let me get, so I want you to critique these abstracts. Hopefully you all see that. Okay, so as the task says here, read through the following 4 scientific abstracts, evaluate their effectiveness in terms of design and layout, presentation of scientific facts, and writing practice. So try and bear in mind the stuff I've just discussed, as well as your own knowledge and from academic writing. Which of the abstracts is most effective and why? So I want you to rank the 4 examples, starting with 1 to indicate the best and 4 to indicate the worst. So we're going in order from best to worst. So say if abstract 2 is the best, that should go first, and then just give me an order, and you can write the numbers in the chat box. Okay, so I'm going to leave that on the screen, and hopefully you might have your own copy anyway. And just have a look through, and we're going to discuss in about 5 minutes before wrapping up the workshop then. So I hope that sounds okay to you, but let me know if there's any issues, okay? I'm going to have a look at your questions as well, and I'm going to answer perhaps after the abstract exercise. So I'll leave you to it for 5 minutes, and then we'll come back, reconvene. Okay. Okay, I'll give you another 2 minutes or so if you want to start writing in a number sequence, moving from best to worst into the chat box. That would be great. Or else you can tell me what you think in a couple of minutes by unmuting. Thanks. Okay, just another few seconds there. If anyone else wants to write in. So it's from best to worst, so you know as well. Okay. Unless anyone else wants to add, I'm going to discuss. Feel free to unmute yourself if you want to say something or what your thoughts are on these abstracts. So I see there's a range of responses here. Of course, some of this is subjective, but we're going to talk through what the logic of your choices might have been. So does anyone want to just say why they numbered as they did?
I think.
Oh yeah, is that Matt?
Yeah.
Yeah, Matt.
I thought it was relatively easy to pick the best and worst ones, and then the middle were more difficult to sort out. We thought the 4 contained spelling and errors and missing words to the point where the sentences don't make any sense.
Yeah.
So this is security intrusions becoming even bigger for the information society. So you think we probably should have said bigger threat or bigger issue, but it doesn't say.
Yeah.
So that one for me was obviously the least good one.
Yeah.
And the detail and the layout of number 3 made that one stand out to be the most bettest one.
Yeah, agreed. Anything else? That's I actually do agree with you on the numbering. That's what I would have chosen too. So, but that doesn't mean anything really. But I agree with you on your points. Abstract 3 for me clearly is the best. Okay, you don't always see these kind of subheadings in abstracts, but it's not wrong to do that. It's just like highlighting a very clear structure. So it has a very clear kind of background to the topic, the methods that are being used, the results with kind of scientifically relevant things like p-values, for instance, and a conclusion to say something about the findings. So, and it's all written well, it flows, the argument flows. So for me, that one clearly is the best. So I would agree with you on that. I know we had some very different thoughts. Some people actually thought number 4 was the best. I'm guessing people were following the best to worst order. That's why I was asking. But for me, number 4 yeah, as you mentioned, there's many issues with this. It's far too brief. There are spelling errors. It just doesn't make very much sense. Like security intrusions are become an even bigger what? Bigger issue. Obviously, it should be for information society, but it's all a very, very general sort of statement. Yeah, it just sounds like a lot of jargon kind of thrown together, to be honest. So for me, I don't think there's any way of salvaging abstract 4. It's just not of a good standard. A fuzzy logic classifier, I mean, what's that? It just sounds like jargon, doesn't it? Be believe, that should be we believe. It's also not very good in the first place to use we so much in academic writing. You can use it sparingly, but I wouldn't be using it, and it's misspelled. So for me, there's no salvaging abstract 4. I agree with you that the 2 other abstracts are a bit more, you kind of can go either way with them. I would personally agree that abstract 2 was the second best, because it does provide an introduction to the topic. You know, it gives a clear outline of the results. It's well expressed and written. The only thing I would say about this one is it doesn't give much insight into the methodology that was used. So how did they do this research? Was it just a kind of desk-based thing, or what was it? So that was the main limitation of this one for me. I realize I'm talking a lot, but just because we agreed on the numbers, I'm just saying some things. The first one, which would be the second worst in my view, it's a general intro, doesn't give too much detail. It's just a bit vague, I would say, this one. It's not as badly written as number 4, because there are errors in that, and it's using jargon, but it's still not very together.
They kept using we.
Yeah.
Not really. Should they just say their company name or school name or whatnot?
Yeah, I mean, you don't need to say we as in the authors argue, or this project found that. You don't need to say we. It's a bit like, you do see it sometimes in abstracts, but I'm a bit wary of it. I wouldn't be using it all the time as it's done in this, personally. But yeah, there's some element of subjectivity in all of this, I have to admit. But if we're kind of looking at criteria for good writing, I think that's the order I would have chosen too, like Matt. But I'm aware I've been talking a lot, so other people need to tell me why they chose as they did. I'm completely non-judgmental. I'm not going to say it. I'm just interested in the logic of why you chose the order you did. So if anyone wants to say anything, please feel free.
I think I kind of rated it wrong. So I said, well, I rated number 1 as number 4, like the last. So I think I kind of misjudged of how I was supposed to type it out, basically. But yeah, definitely not saying that number 4 was the best. That's not what I kind of particularly. I said it was one of the worst, but yeah.
Yeah.
I guess the thing is that it's how you structure it depending on your type of study. So it looks like number 3 is quite medical orientated. That's why they broke down the introduction methodology, because I've looked at other abstracts and some of them don't formulate it like that, basically. Yeah,
you're right. This is something you do often see more. You do see it quite a lot in medical science, actually. Not so much. I'm actually an arts humanities scholar. I'm not a marine science person, but you wouldn't often see the subheadings, but it isn't wrong, as I say. Actually, in this case, it's quite helpful, because you clearly see what each section is referring to, and I think it actually just makes it quite easy to read. So there is some element of you're right, disciplinary kind of thing in this. You may not see it, and sometimes it's journal styles as well. For instance, if you see an abstract in a journal, some might have told the authors to write with subheadings, some might not. So there's some element of disciplinary thing, there's some element of style, but it's not wrong to do it that way. As long as it's clear, that is the main thing. Clearly written, clearly structured. But yeah, you're right. Any other thoughts? Does anyone want to add something to the discussion?
Just have a question though. Although for number 3, you have very structured way, but are we okay to write it, follow the similar structure, but without the subheading, using more words to connect them together? Would that be another way of doing it? Or
Yeah, thanks for the question, Jing. Yes, totally. As in, as long as it's clear, you could just leave out the subheadings in this. In fact, it would still be quite clear. It's just the author has chosen to mark it in a slightly more structured way, but it would equally, it would be fine actually if you just removed the subheadings, in my view.
so it would be important to cover, your introduction, of course, and then the methods you're using, and it also what's your results. So that will be a good way to structure your abstract.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, so have a clear kind of background, what your research question is, and methods, like results, and a very brief conclusion. It all depends on your word count as well. Depends on what you're writing for. I think MLA, like they're a bit vague, I have to say, on the project handbooks about how many words the abstract is, but I think it doesn't matter too much, because I did find out last week that the abstract isn't actually included in the word count for the thesis anyway, but still needs to be pretty concise. So it depends, you have to write according to word counts as well, but it's usually a couple hundred words for an abstract. So you just have to bear that in mind when you're writing. But yeah, this is a generally good kind of structure: background, question, methods, results, conclusion. But also have a look at the handbook, because it tells you precisely what MLA wants in the abstract as well. But that is generally what an abstract covers anyway. There's not too much difference in, regardless of institution. So that's why I think that one works, because it's very clear. But yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that's great. And also it's good to know the abstract is not included in the word count as well. I normally thought that's part of, your entire, dissertation. Yeah.
Yeah, I did. I was very confused because another student didn't know whether it was or not. And I asked, and they kind of were like, yeah, it's not. It usually isn't. So I think that it should be all right. It's not. Yeah.
I think. Thank you.
No worries. Anyone else who wants to chip something in before? I know, I'm aware, sorry, we're a bit over time, but these things often do go over time. Anyone else? No, it's all as clear as mud. Great. Okay. If no one else wants to say anything, I'm going to stop sharing the screen. I'm aware there's a few comments in this chat box that I haven't looked at yet. Chat. Second one, yeah. Grammarly, yes, you can use that actually. I have never used it personally myself, so I can't really comment on what edition I use, but I guess just use the most up-to-date one. I've never used it personally myself, but a basic thing on Microsoft Word, which many people use for typing these days, is their spell and grammar check. It does a pretty good job. What Grammarly I've heard is very useful, kind of teaches you techniques rather than just telling you what's wrong and you just press correct. So yeah, have a look into that if you're interested. PowerPoint, yes, I will ask Carly for a PowerPoint to be sent out. I know someone else asked that last time as well. Wendy, is there any normative content or format for developing a good thesis? I would encourage you to look at the handbook for MLA for your particular course, which outlines very clearly what a good structure is. Obviously, you need a kind of introduction, literature review, that kind of also foregrounds your research question, methodology, discussion, findings, and a conclusion with a reference list. That would be a general structure for a thesis, but do have a look at MLA's handbook also. Hope that answers the questions. I've one small final section that I need to go through on my presentation. So I'm just going to share that again where I left off. I think it's this. Yeah, so we've just done this exercise, which was useful, I hope. And we reached some consensus, but you might want to look back on the abstracts and think about it in terms of what's been discussed in this presentation. And hopefully it'll be helpful for you as you go forward. So referencing, I'm just going to do a very short section on referencing. Now, everything is in the how to reference guide on your TLP, which hopefully you should at this stage have looked at. We're using Harvard referencing, so I'm only going to mention that today. It's a crucial part of academic writing. If you don't reference correctly, basically you're not really writing academically. You need to reference everything you write. At MLA College, we employ Harvard citation and practice. It needs to be consistent in terms of layout and punctuation. So often I see references are generally laid out well, or they can be, but then extra commas are put in or brackets are used wrong or things like that, and it actually does make a difference. So I'm going to briefly mention that here. And essentially, this is like a formula. I mean, all you need to do is to follow it carefully and no marks will be unnecessarily lost, because it's basically everything is written out in the handbook, exactly how you reference a book chapter, exactly how you reference a journal article. There is no reason why it should be done wrong if you just follow exactly what it says. It's like following a manual. So there's kind of no excuse, really. There's even all these citation tools to help you create all your references these days if you want to use them. Zotero is one, and EndNote. I've personally never used them. I've always just created my own reference list, but if you want a bit of help, a lot of people do use them and they can be helpful. You just need to make sure they're done in the right style so that you're doing it in Harvard style if you use that. There's also Cite This for Me if you want a bit of help with, if you're just feeling a bit lazy, essentially. But otherwise, I would try and do your references yourself. There's no reason why you can't. So this is the basic formula for Harvard referencing. Very simple. In text referencing, you have a pair of brackets, one open, the other closed, the surname, a comma, a space, the year. That is all you need to do to reference an author. If you include a direct quotation in quotation marks, then you need to also include a page number for the quote. You cannot just quote someone in quotation marks and not give the page for where in the original text it was found. That needs to be included. So in this case, it goes brackets with surname, comma, year, comma, page number. Again, it's just like this formula, just with a page number. Hopefully that makes sense. If you use the author's name to start the sentence, then the format should be surname with just the year in brackets. This is something I see wrong quite a lot, that people put the surname and the year in brackets at the start of a sentence, and it shouldn't be that way. So I'm going to give a quick example. Yeah, note the placement of brackets. All references should be in alphabetical order, starting from A and going to Z according to the author's surname. So do bear that in mind. So your reference list at the end, this is. Note that the different types of sources, so journal articles, book chapters, have different referencing formats. So you just need to follow the format for the different type of source. And keeping punctuation consistent is as important as the format of the reference itself. So this is an example article. This is a journal article in the reference list. So you have the surname, their initial, so you don't write out their full first name, it's just the initial, the year of publication, the title of the journal article, not in italics, the title of the journal in italics, the volume number, the issue number in brackets, and a page range. And that is exactly how you do Harvard referencing. Hope that makes sense. It's also in the how to reference guide. So if you're using this in text, at the end of a sentence, in the whole thing, surname, year in brackets, if you're starting a sentence with the author's name, note that it is just their surname, just the year in brackets. So that's something to note. It's a different format. Hopefully you can look back on this and it all makes sense afterwards. I think I'm almost finished at this stage. I'm going to review the learning outcomes and I'll answer any final questions. So basically our outcomes were to understand the difference between formal and informal writing. So active, passive voice, third, first person, formal tone, colloquial, which hopefully you do at this stage. To think more about writing structure, so paragraphing, signposting, which all help to aid the flow, and to improve the writing, to understand and to be able to use Harvard citational practice, both in text and in the reference list, which I've just gone through very quickly, but gone through. My two take-home messages: if in doubt, check it out. If in doubt, leave it out. So hopefully that will make sense by now. Here are the academic sources I've mentioned in this presentation. So if you want to look more about why is academic writing important, you can go to this Learn Higher link. And there's the Truss, Eats, Shoots and Leaves punctuation grammar book that you might want to have a quick look at if you want to improve those aspects of your writing. This is me. If you want to email me, that's my email address. Happy to answer any questions afterwards if there's anything that you still don't understand. Also, I'll make sure the PowerPoint is sent on to you afterwards, so that should be okay. I want to thank you for your time. I'm going to have a quick look at the chat box in case there's something. Can you supply future questions? What do you mean by future questions? Oh, I'm glad the PowerPoint has been emailed to you in PDF format. That's good. I didn't realize. So that's really good. So you'll have it afterwards, as well as this on the forum. I'm not sure what you mean by future questions. So maybe if you can clarify that. But we are kind of running out of time and we're already over time. So I hope it's been helpful for you. I'll be running another one next week. That one's going to be more about, I think someone mentioned in the questions something about taking notes. I'm going to be covering that next time. So how to take effective notes, reading strategies, things like that, that might help. And we're going to be looking at, don't be daunted by the example that's sent on. It may be way outside of your field because it's more from my own field, but it's going to be an example of a really interesting example actually from peer-reviewed literature, so an article that got through peer review, but there are many, many issues that need to be unpicked with it. So I think it could be quite an interesting discussion if you want to come along to that one same time next week, Wednesday. It'll be really good. I know the materials will be sent on to you in advance, so you can have a good look at the articles that we're going to be discussing. So I'm glad everyone found it very helpful. Thanks for the comments. That's good to know. This will be up on the forum. I think that's the end, yeah, to be decided, but it is actually next week. I'm going to stop this share. Thanks very much. If you don't have any further questions, I'm going to leave you to it and hope to see you next week then. So thanks very much for this morning. Have a good one and hopefully see you next week then. All right. Thanks very much.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.